Okay, I'm just going to summarise a few points from the first day of our kind of 2-day little session. Sun setting, birds are singing, it's all quite nice at the moment. Right, so one of the things that we picked up on, especially through the exercise where we got everyone to talk for 2 minutes about their research project, was the importance of being able to talk concisely about your research project. And that's not dumbing down, that's being smart, okay? And one of the things that was either missing completely or was only there implicitly, an important thing for most of them, was this thing about why, okay? So you were telling us about what your research was about, what it involved, but why does it matter? Why is it important? Be sure to make that connection for people. People may be able to work out what it is, but why give them that extra job, okay? So you explain concisely what your research project is about, and then be able to tell them kind of why it matters. Several of you talked about the methodology, which is a fantastic thing. If you're talking to fellow academics, it's always worth having a kind of 30-second, 60 version or whatever of your methods that you can talk about as well. It's not an easy thing to do, and everyone today who did it did a really good job, so well done. Do think about, you can practice this kind of thing in the mirror, or many of you will have devices like phones and iPads. I'm currently talking to an iPad, where you can practice recording yourself. It may seem a bit of an odd thing to do, but it might be worthwhile. One of the other things that you'll find useful if you do that is also you'll sometimes pick up kind of verbal tics and other tics that you don't realise you're doing. Certainly I'm filmed on a number of occasions for teaching and learning assessments, or I'm filmed doing presentations, and something I say an awful lot is okay. I keep emphasising things in okay, and it drives me mad occasionally. I probably do it a bit less now because I've picked up on that, but we've all got these little tics and things to do. And again, I was recording something with colleagues last week, and I realised I was sat in a chair that swiveled, and I kept swivelling. Whenever I wasn't talking, I was swivelling, but we were all being recorded. So little things like that can make a difference. So practice being able to tell people within a couple of minutes what your research is about and why it matters. Okay, that's a really good thing to do. Really helpful. One of the other things that we picked up from today was thinking about how you chose your particular methodological approaches. And I'll talk to people more about that tomorrow on a one-to-one basis. Again, it was heartening to see that a lot of you had made the decision independently or jointly with your supervisors. I'm aware that's not always the case. I like to think that at this particular university, we're really quite supportive of students. But I'm aware that isn't always the case at some institutions, and that sometimes people are forced into making decisions around it. Do bear in mind as well, it's okay to be honest about kind of practical, pragmatic limitations. You've got certain limited funds, maybe zero funds or limited funds. You've got a limited time scale in which to carry out the work, as well as a kind of limited skill set that's available. Just recognise that, that's okay. And just be prepared to talk about it. You might say, in the ideal world that you would have done this, this and this, but show that you've thought about why you perhaps aren't doing certain things. So ideally you would have flown all around the place and conducted focus groups. Not practical. So what's a good fallback solution? You've thought about it, okay? Equally, we talked about why you might have rejected certain methodological approaches. So again, that's useful to talk about. You may be doing a presentation at some point to somebody who absolutely loves a particular approach, and that you've rejected. You've implicitly rejected it, perhaps because you've not adopted it. So just be prepared, you get that question from the floor. It may be well-meaning, it may be loaded, that says why you've rejected certain things. Okay, so that was one of the useful things that we picked up. One of the other things that we talked about today was we talked about social media to quite some extent here and there. So I kind of talked about it right at the beginning, and then we came back to it later on in the afternoon. Thank you for the survey, by the way. The survey results have now come through. So I'll talk to you briefly about that tomorrow, about what people were doing. It's evident that you're fairly heavily engaged with social media in different ways, certainly on a personal level and to some extent to a professional level. This is coming through more and more each year, which is kind of what we'd expect, but again, it's nice to get a confirmation of it, to see it. And hopefully you found it useful when I did that little guided tour around some of the links that are on now. So there are loads of supporting materials on now. It would be boring for you, right, and not good use of my time if I went through every link and every resource in the kind of the live streams that we're doing, which is why I'm selecting certain things and why I've asked you things about what's your research question about, what your research methods, approaches, what's your social media usage, this kind of stuff, so that I can shape what I'm doing for you. And people seem to appreciate these kind of relatively short targeted chunks of stuff that we're looking at. Again, as Ellie Mackin Roberts, who was one of the video clips that I played, pointed out, you don't have to engage on social media. It's not a competition, but do have a think about it, and also think about what's right for you. Some things are better for some people than others. As you can see from my demonstration of my Twitter account, I use Twitter quite a lot. I've got big networks of followers on there. I found it really, really useful. Other people may use things like Instagram more, or things like YouTube more, or use combinations of stuff. There's no particularly right or wrong answer. It kind of depends on what you like and what you're comfortable with, but also where your community lies. Okay, so it may be that for certain disciplinary groups, that they've naturally migrated to a number of platforms, and you tend to follow them where they're at. Okay, so it turns out there's a critical mass of psychologists use a particular platform. Then if you're a psychologist, it makes sense for you to have a presence on there, perhaps amongst other platforms, but certainly presence on there. If it turns out that Twitter and YouTube are real hotbeds for discussing topics such as vegan lifestyles and stuff like that, then that's the place you're going to be. Think too about places like Pinterest and stuff as well. We didn't cover Pinterest, but again, we talked about Instagram. Some research topics are intrinsically perhaps a bit more visual, either in the way that you can present the results or in the way that materials are out there for you to look at. I've got a few questions which we talked about briefly about, this issue about whether you can harvest material from social media. There are no definitive answers there. It's definitely something you need to talk about with your research team. You are very welcome to come back with me, come back to me, and we can have a think about it. We can check what the current policies are, etc., etc. But initially, if you can go back to your research teams and see if they have a stance on it. It is one of these that that it's a bit undecided in terms of what you can troll from, what you can rake from, what you can pull from, all this kind of publicly available data. And the public can do what it likes with it, but ironically as researchers you're still bound by certain considerations. Okay, we looked at using with Twitter things like PhD, hash PhD chat, so using particular hashtags, looking at particular groups, building up your followers over time, etc., etc. Sarah kindly shared the fact that she has a blog with us, and she was telling us about some of the things around the blog. So again, blogs are a good thing to think about looking at doing. And I pointed out some of the academic videos. Lucy Kizik I've mentioned a few times, and we showed some of hers. Again, there's a real strength in depth there. She's been doing these on a regular basis. One of the things that can be really helpful is if you're like scrolling something down on a blog, and it might be just got a spare 10 minutes. And some of the blogging platforms, such as the one that I use, which is available through Google, you can access them through your mobile phone. So you might be sat on a bus, stuck in the traffic, or you're sat waiting for somebody to turn up, the start of a lecture or something, and you've got 5 minutes you could kill, and you could post an update from your mobile device. You don't have to be sat at a computer to compose these things. And the real value comes in the kind of collective quantity of the work that kind of appears over time, and that people can see that you are genuinely interested in social psychology, that you're genuinely interested in astrogeology, or whatever it is that you happen to be studying, okay? Because you're engaging with it over time, and it's really useful. Similar thing, it takes a while to build up things like interactions and Twitter followers, but after a while you can get a critical mass. Other platforms may suit other people. We mentioned things like Facebook and stuff. Again, have a look at what suits you and where you will find your people. Okay, so your people being the kind of people from your disciplinary background, or the people maybe who are looking at your research topic, or the people who are using the kind of methods that you're using, or simply PhD students. Okay, something that we didn't cover, and I will talk about it briefly tomorrow, a bit I missed out on, was a kind of really rapidly expanding area which is very useful, is a podcast, which is one of my favourite areas. And ironically, it occurred to me earlier, while taking the dog for a walk and listening to a podcast that in fact I'd forgotten to talk about podcast with you. So academic podcasting is a big growth area, and definitely something that you want to consider. We had to think about backup strategies, and for some people it was a bit of a wake-up call. They realised that perhaps they didn't have a really good backup strategy in place. Get some kind of backup in place. There's a whole different range of ways to do it, as we discussed in the session. But just have something. You do not want to be losing vital bits of work. If a laptop fails on you, if a laptop's stolen, if whatever happens, you lose connectivity to drives, have some kind of backups in place. Occasionally email yourself. There are plenty of free email services. So stuff that's in progress, email it to yourself. Okay. So then there's a copy on your local computer because it's in your sent items. There'll be a copy that's perhaps on the server that's accessible, and there'll be a copy of in the email account of where you sent it to. So actually emailing is quite a good way of doing it, or using shared drives and networks. By all means use physical hard drives that you can plug in as well. They're they're quick and they're efficient, but just beware that you don't want the laptop and the hard drive stolen, or you leave it on the underground or the bus or in a pub or whatever, and your laptop and your work and your backup were all in the same bag that you left somewhere. Okay, so that's happened to people before. So have a strategy. Doesn't matter what it is as long as you've got one. We talked about the use of reference managers, and many of you are quite happy with the reference managing support that's built into Microsoft Word, and that's got a lot better over the years, and that's certainly something that you can look at doing and using. And again, in terms of backups, you can think about whether you like to use Word as a standalone application that's downloaded to your desktop, or use the online versions. There are pros and cons to each of these, which you can have a think about. Crucially, we talked about using services like Mendeley and Zotero. And as I was saying earlier, I've read loads of reviews of them. I've read loads of individual people's opinions of them, as well as people like librarians and information specialists. There is no clear winner. To some extent, it's kind of, well, what do you like? Are you a Windows person or a Mac person? Are you a Zotero person or a Mendeley person? You could possibly use both. But what you don't want to be doing is kind of manually trying to copy and paste and make notes of all your references and stuff, because when you come to compile all this, okay, and often you're going to recompile stuff as you add things in and take things out, and then recompile your kind of set of references at the end. This is where that software comes into its own. It will save you a lot of time and stress. It's also really useful, as we were saying, if you are taking perhaps something that you're working on and you want to submit it to different journals. Okay, so you have to submit them to a succession of journals. You can't submit to several at the same time, because you'll see there's strict regulations against that. But one might want it in Harvard format, one might want it in the American Psychological Association 6th edition version, one might want it in something else. You don't have to learn lots of formatting styles, because these reference managers are generally pretty good at squirting stuff out in an appropriate style. Okay, so that's some of the stuff that we picked up on today. It was a really useful session. People were really kind of very good, and they asked questions about people's presentations, and everyone was really supportive. That makes my life a lot easier. We thought a little bit as well about your question. I didn't go into lots of detail about it. I did get you to do the little forms and fill them in. And again, you're all at the stage where you've got a specific question that you're kind of working towards. So I haven't talked much about how to formulate a good question, because you've all gone through that phase with your teams already. But if you're not sure about something, then you can come back and ask me about, how do you kind of formulate a good question? And the short answer is, what you're aiming to get is something really quite specific, okay? Because if you've got a broad question, it's very difficult to show that you've addressed it successfully, even in the length of a dissertation, okay? So a specific question, it's much easier to show that you've successfully addressed that in the terms of the length of a dissertation. Okay, I went through a few things from the workshop content. I've got like a little printed version here. There are electronic versions online, and I said that in the light of the feedback that I get, I would kind of ration out and prioritise some bits to talk in the live sessions. I've been looking through the background materials, and again I will just update some of the links and materials that are on there for you, and I will add in some additional video resources, which is perhaps screenshots of me demonstrating a few things. which you then have the option of going back to check. Okay. Tomorrow we do have to talk about, again, we kind of touched upon it today just because sometimes stuff naturally comes up and we preempt stuff. Just this thing, you know, linked to backing up stuff. The flip side to backing up stuff is actually then deleting stuff, and it's also about secure data storage and things like that. So again, some of it we touched on today. We'll go across it briefly tomorrow. Also thinking about dealing with data and documents at the end of the project, what you do in terms of archiving stuff and having collections of stuff, and really just kind of dealing with more questions and stuff you got. The one other thing that we'll be looking at as well, of course, is this visual presentation of your materials. So thinking about how might you produce a poster, whether it's electronic or a printed version, that helps convey some of what you're doing. And I explained that, you know, this is a really good way sometimes to get yourself invited to conferences and stuff like that. This is not childish, producing posters, and certainly we have undergraduate students who we set designing academic posters as assignment, and they think it's really easy. And they think it's really easy right up until they actually start doing it and realise there are lots of tensions and compromises to be made in terms of, if you want really big attractive graphics to get people's attention, then you're sacrificing space for text. If you're sacrificing space for text, it means you can't put in those explanations and other things that you want to do on a poster, which goes with the kind of nature of academic work. Okay, so things like posters are not easy to do, but they can be really useful. And then it also maps in, we talked about Petrocuta style presentations, or you could have a traditional style PowerPoint presentation. Again, think about how to make the most of those. And what I'll do tomorrow perhaps is just show you again a couple of another couple of examples of presentations that I've used, because again, you can break away from the traditional kind of style of PowerPoint with lots of bullet points and stuff. You can do things like embed video and stuff into it. So we'll look at things like that. I'll make a note of myself to do it. Okay, so if you weren't in attendance for day one, then you missed lots of good stuff. If you were in attendance, a very big thank you once again, because you made my life a lot easier by asking questions of one another, asking questions of me, and contributing, and it seemed to go okay. As I said right at the beginning, we'd normally run this in the classroom, so I've had to kind of chop and change what I'd normally do in order to cope with that kind of thing. If you can hear a noise, it's actually, oh, he's gone. Oh, here he comes. It's our greyhound. There we go, that's Jeff, the retired greyhound, who was just having a late evening sprint around the garden. He's like a rocket ship. Hello, mate. Okay, so as we were saying, you can email me outside of the sessions and contact me outside of the sessions. So if you suddenly think of something, whether it's later this evening, depends when you see this video, or whether it's on day 2 or it's after the day 2's finished, that's okay, get in touch. If it's a few weeks down the line or whatever, and suddenly something comes up that's relevant to what we've been doing, and you think I can help, then again, get in touch. That's not a problem. Okay. All right then. That was my little summary from day 1 onwards to day 2.